Back in the old days, back in the 1850s and before, how do the club makers finish off the wood? How do they polish it? Well, one way was to use a card scraper, and this is just a somewhat flexible piece of metal that you sharpen with a or hone with a file and sharpening stones and a burnisher and get a lip. You bend a little burr over the edge of this piece of metal. So let me show you what that looks like. So here we're just bending it a little bit. You can see the shavings. So maybe some of the club makers stopped right at that point. But we do read in some of the historical recollections that Hugh Philp was scraping and sanding his clubs. Maybe he would spend the whole afternoon doing that. Well, around 1830, 3M wasn't around, but they had commercial sandpaper by that time. But before that, people, cabinet makers, woodworkers, perhaps club makers, would make their own sandpaper or glass paper in this instance here. So this is a thick paper that has hide glue on it, and I sprinkled crushed glass onto it. I'm trying to find out if there's any difference between glass paper that they used compared to the sandpaper that we have today. And I must say it does cut pretty nicely. It seems like it's sharper. So let me show you how I made that. So what I did was I took a jar actually and broke the jar and crushed it inside of a plastic bucket, and of course I wore safety goggles. And then I put it through a gauze after I crushed it, and I got particles that look like sand actually. And then I took hide glue and brushed on the hide glue onto some paper that was tacked down onto a wooden board. And this is from G.A. Siddons, George Siddons from 1825, Cabinet Maker's Guide. And he talks about how to make it in this fashion. So you put the glue on, then you sift the glass particles on there. And I also wear rubber gloves so I don't get these little particles in there. And this is kind of a catch basin piece of paper here. And then just let it dry, and you can cut it up to whatever size you want to have it cut up. So here's that piece of glass paper. I'm going against the grain there, but it seems like it works fairly well, pretty well. At least as good as sandpaper. I haven't used it all that much yet, but this would be nice to get into edges on the golf club. Next in line in their armamentarium in the pre-1830s days, they also used sharkskin. Now this is an imitation metallic sharkskin. It's actually almost like a rasp, but sharkskin from the dogfish shark or some rough fish skin was sometimes used for sanding, especially in tight spots. So this is available from a company called Mac, and it almost works like a tiny rasp. And I would say it's a little bit finer than the glass paper that I made. So it's nice for getting into a little. This thing's nice for getting into little tight spaces, like when I want to sand the edge here of the wood right next to the lead, and I don't want to contaminate the lead into the wood. So it's nice for getting into tight spots. Now on a finer level, I've showed this on some previous posts. You have the Dutch rush, horsetail rush. And in fact, back in the old days, they, instead of saying sanding, we sanded the wood. The abrasive, to use an abrasive, they said we rushed the wood. So any of those old books with, pre-1800, when the S's all look like F's, they rushed the wood, or roughed, I guess would be, with that S that looks like an F in those old books. But anyway, so this is Dutch rush, and I like it fresh off the plant. If you can just have a pot growing in your backyard, and I would say this is about a 400 grit equivalent. And then finally we have what's called Tripoli powder, or Tripoli paste if you mix it with a little bit of oil. And this is used for very fine polish. And I prefer this over steel wool when I'm polishing a finish. So I take a piece of felt and put a little bit of mineral oil on it and just sprinkle the Tripoli paste, or now we call it rotten stone or pumice. And I think they're very close. Here's the company that makes it. It's a very fine powder, and I like the finish. It doesn't give any scratches at all. I'm sure there are micro scratches because that's how all abrasives work. But you just sprinkle a little bit on. It doesn't give as much of a scratchy appearance as even the 000, triple aught steel wool. So there's definitely instances where they talk about using Tripoli powder, Tripoli paste. So I don't know exactly 100% what combination guys like James McEwen or Hugh Philp pre-1830 would have polished their clubs. For sure they used the scraper. A scraper is pretty much essential. But then after that, my guess is they use these rushes and probably some Tripoli paste. Whether they use sharkskin, I don't know. Did they use glass paper? I don't know for sure. Perhaps they did. But Hugh Philp was a joiner. I think James McEwen was also some type of woodworker prior to becoming a club maker. So they definitely were exposed to these kind of abrasives. And finally, there's something which I doubt they used, but this is if you want to get a really fine, almost a burnished finish. This is called a polissoir. There's a gentleman by the name of Don Williams who gave a talk in Colonial Williamsburg at a meeting that I attended, and he talked about how Andre Roubaud from the 1700s used this thing called a polissoir, which is you put a little wax on this very tight, almost like it's like basically a broom that's very tight, and you use a lot of effort, and you'll get a burnished appearance. So you're burnishing the wood. I doubt they use that, but I doubt club makers use that. You can see the shine on that versus the part where I didn't touch yet. Perhaps, woodworkers definitely used it to some degree, but I don't know to what extent. Club makers probably not. So that's just a summary of polishing golf clubs back in the old days.